Okay. The opacity of the world, of the life world, general overview. The issue of the opacity of the life world is addressed by Schutz on the basis of two interrelated cartographic metaphors, the use of maps and the isoipsis of relevancies. This metaphorical interpretation is not fortuitous. Among other traits, life world is ground and horizon. Both horizon and ground are constitutive conditions for experience. Together, they make up the concept of life world as territory. Life world is then delimited as our historical cultural territory. The use of maps. The allegorical reference to the use of maps expresses the conversion of our perception of the life world into control lines or hatchings, which corresponds to the phenomenological insight that objects are given in perception through manifesting sights or adumbrations. According to Schutz, life world is grasped with the help of the stock of knowledge, much in the way one locates oneself in countryside with the aids of map. The explanation of signs, description of places, etc. are taken from the prevailing objective geography. The choice of maps and above all, the choice of the scale to be used is motivated subjectively. I quote, "We can graphically imagine this in the following manner. Hatched contours are sketched on the object of experience. The density of the hatching is dependent on the levels of familiarity, determinateness, and credibility. Around these hatchings are the empty places of the relative opaque. According to the relation of hatching and empty stretches, the contours are sharper or hazier. Only that which is intransparent in principle forms a genuine terra incognita. In the same way as a map sketches our perception of the land through different outlines of regions, contours, and shadings, our stock of knowledge sketches our perception of the life world by adumbrations, shadings, hatched contours, and empty stretches. As Schutz and Luckman describe, there is always, and quote, something unfamiliar sketched behind the familiar, something undetermined behind the determined. This residua of opacity, which can be demonstrated in every element of knowledge, announce the intransparency of the life world. The metaphor of the relevance isoipsis helps Schutz to describe the structurization of our stock of knowledge into theme and horizons, the level of familiarity and typicality we perceive in the objects of the world, and also the incomplete character of our knowledge, that is, the empty places sketched in it as a consequence of the opacity of the life world. The system of relevancies outlines the contours of what it is thematically and what is merely horizontal of our life world, and plays a core role in the structurization of our stock of knowledge. It is the set of actual interest which itself depends upon the autobiographical and situational circumstances in the individual that limit the level of investigation, that is, the borderline up to which a segment of the world has to be put into question, and beyond this borderline, which segment remains unquestioned. If we had to draw a map depicting the distribution of the system of relevancies, it would resemble a topographical map. Peaks and valleys, foothills and slopes are spread over the map in infinitely diversified configurations. The system of relevancies is similar to a system of isoipsis. And I quote, "Let us imagine that we could make a similar graph of our stock of knowledge of equal degrees of familiarity or of equal relevance. We would then obtain a map showing the contour lines of our life world as taken for granted beyond question. We may speak of relevance isoipsis." 2. Home world and alien world. According to what has been said, life world as defined in its modalities of earth, ground, and world horizon is also understood as a geographical and historical constitutive condition for intersubjective experience. In this sense, not only our experience of the objects announces the intransparency of the life world, but also our experience of other subjects announces the existence of invisible aspects in social interaction. For this reason, the analysis of opacity in intersubjective experience requires a discussion of the distinction between home world and alien world. Husserlian transcendental phenomenology of the life world is relevant here. Husserl characterizes the alien as a verifiable accessibility of what is inaccessible originally. And in his On the Phenomenology of Intersubjectivity, he speaks in a similarly paradoxical fashion about the accessibility in genuine inaccessibility in the mode of incomprehensibility. The formulation with which Husserl characterizes alienness means that something or someone is accessible not in spite of, but rather in its inaccessibility. In the words of Husserl, we might say that the life world is from the very beginning divided into home world and alien world, and at the same time that ownness and alienness are present with equal originality. The Husserlian distinction between home world and alien world as part of his phenomenological account of intersubjectivity highlights the transcendence or radical alterity of the other. However, as something or someone that cannot be comprehended, alienness does not mean that the door of reality is bolted shut, but rather that its sense is not fully disclosed. Familiarity and strangeness as a fundamental dimension of human condition. The transcendence of the other and his in-principle inaccessibility represent an omnipresent source of unfamiliarity and strangeness that is contained in the structure of the life world. From the point of view of a philosophical anthropology, Schutz states that strangeness and familiarity are not limited to the social field, but are general categories of our interpretation of the world. I quote, certain features are common to all social worlds because they are rooted in the human condition. Everywhere we find sex groups and age groups and some division of labor conditioned by them, and more or less rigid kinship organization that arrange the social world into zones of varying social distance, from intimate familiarity to strangeness. According to Bernhard Waldenfels, the separation in the life world between home world and alien world, which, as mentioned, stem from Husserl, corresponds to the well-known difference between in-group and out-group. In other words, just as the alien is both what is inaccessible and what does not belong to another, the structure of accessible and inaccessible on the social level corresponds to the structure of belonging and not belonging. From this viewpoint, it is possible to assert that Schutzian distinction between in-group and out-group is founded on the experience of familiarity and strangeness that is a dimension of our human condition. What I am proposing here is that the constitutive analysis of the experience of strangeness, understood as a trait of our human condition and of our experience of the life world, is the preliminary condition for the historical construction of social distance between different groups in the social world. Social distance. The experience of familiarity and strangeness that is contained in the structure of the life world is organized in the social world into zones of varying social distance between social groups. Social distance is defined as the relationships of proximity and distance, familiarity and strangeness between social groups, which is experienced in the social world in terms of we and they. That distinction is usually approached by sociologists with terms such as social classes, system, role, status, and role expectation, among others. However, group differences are experienced by the individual actor on the social scenes in entirely different terms. To the actor in the social world, the social divisions denoted by those concepts are interpreted as elements of a network of typification, that is, typification of other human individuals, of their course of action patterns, of their motives and goals, or of their social cultural products which originated in their actions. The ways of life of the in-group, that is the socially approved system of typification and the particular structure of the domains of relevancies, are taken for granted and are linked to the dynamic of the social structure that exists at any historical moment. In order to delve into the experience of familiarity and reciprocal strangeness between groups, Schutz analyzes the experiences of congruency and incongruence of the stock of knowledge and its correlative cultural pattern. The experience of congruency. Congruency of cultural patterns and their interpretive schemes, which include structures of relevance and typicality, can be expected amongst members of in-groups. Familiarity is a characteristic of the stock of knowledge inherent to a group. Notwithstanding, there are different levels of congruency, and Schutzian thesis, general thesis of the reciprocity of perspectives, contributes by describing a process which Ilya Strugar refers as the rule of acceptance of strangeness. According to Schutz, common sense thinking overcomes the differences in individual perspectives by two basic idealizations: the idealization of the interchangeability of the standpoints and the idealization of the congruency of the system of relevancies. To this idealization should be added the idealization of reciprocity of motives, which assumes my own motives as being interlocked with that of my partners in social interaction. These idealizations depends upon the general thesis of the reciprocity of perspectives, since it implies that the motive imputed to the other are typically the same as my own or that of others in typically similar circumstances. Through this set of idealizations, congruency and familiarity in the stock of knowledge can be achieved. The constitution of the other is based on the assumption of the reciprocity of perspectives. However, incongruity also emerges in social interaction as a consequence of the differentiation of the life world. I will present two sources of incongruence. First, the discrepancy between the definition of the situation in the social world by the group and by the stranger, and second, the discrepancy between the subjective and the objective interpretation of the group. First, the position of each social group in the social structure is accompanied by a definition of its situation within the social territory, and the discrepancy between definitions is at the origin of the differences between groups and of the experience of strangeness between them. The ways of life of the group establish the standard in terms of which the in-group defines its situation. This discrepancy can be clearly seen in the stranger ideal type. The cultural pattern of the in-group and its corresponding stock of knowledge function as a scheme of orientation in the social territory. This means that the stock of knowledge acts as a map that helps the member of the group to locate themselves in the social life world. The stranger starts to interpret his new social environment in terms of his thinking as usual, that is, within the scheme of reference brought from his home group. However, he lacks any status as a member of the social group he is about to join and is therefore unable to obtain a starting point to get his bearings. He finds himself a border case outside the territory covered by the scheme of orientation current within the group. Schutzian stranger meets obstacles in his attempt at interpreting the approach group and faces incongruence and distortion of his stock of knowledge at hand and the corresponding control line of his own group relevance systems. As a consequence of this incongruence, the level of familiarity of our stock of knowledge diminishes and strangeness takes possession of intersubjective relationships. The other's transcendence, which is a general feature of our experience of the world, is experienced in its extreme form in the case of the stranger. Consequently, strangeness and misunderstanding emerge in social interaction between groups. Second, according to Schutz, different dimensions can be highlighted for the study of social distance between groups, whether they be affective, a feeling shared by the members that they belong together, interactive, the nature of the bond that holds a group together, and the extent, duration, or intimacy of the social contact, or cultural, the way of life of the in-group, that is the socially approved system of typification and particular structure of the domain of relevancies. However, another trait must be taken into account. Social distance also refers to the different attitudes and valuation of a group toward alterity in terms of acceptance, tolerance, intolerance, hostility, confrontation, and discrimination, among others. According to Schutz, one's own group considers itself as the center of everything, and all others are scaled, rated, and evaluated in reference to it. The members of an out-group do not consider the ways of life of the in-group as self-evident truth. Each group thinks that its own folkways are the only right ones, and if it observes that other groups have other folkways, valuation processes emerge on the social scene. The alien world of the other appears colored by the prejudices of the home world. It is not only excluded and discriminated against, but it is also devalued. Its valuation, cognitions, and normativity are not valid in relation to the home world. The alien world constitutes a potential threat to concepts of the world and to the humanity from the point of view of the home world. This leads to the second source of incongruence in social relationships between groups, the discrepancy between the subjective and the objective interpretation of the group. The folkways of others are imposed upon us in the social world. The system of relevancies and typification of others may seem strange and opaque to us. This opacity of the stranger, that is, the invisible aspect of the other that emerge in social interaction, can be filled with multiple social meanings. In the words of Schutz, the interpretation of the group by the outsider will never fully coincide with the self-interpretation of the group, of the in-group. That is, the relevance imposed by the outsider will not match with the intrinsic relevancies of the in-group. For this reason, the system of relevancies leading to such typification is taken for granted by the outsider, but is not necessarily accepted by the individual who may not be prepared to perform the corresponding self-typification. I quote, "The resultant discrepancy between the subjective and the objective interpretation of the group remains relatively harmless so long as the individual thus typified are not subject to the outsider control. If, however, the outsider has the power to impose his system of relevancies upon the individual typified by him, and especially to enforce its institutionalization, then this fact will create various repercussions on the situation of the individual typified against their will. Discrimination is one of the different attitudes through which the in-group evaluates other groups. Accordingly, the phenomenological concept of social distance allows for both disclosing underlying mechanisms of social differentiation and for explaining the social constructions of the other as a stranger, as well as the particular attitudes between groups which might lead to xenophobia, racism, or discrimination. There are different ways in which the in-group defines, categorizes, measures, compares, evaluates, and evaluates other groups, which may lead to various attitudes of the in-group toward the out-group. However, a complete typology cannot be established on the ground of theoretical deliberation, but a wide field seems open here for badly needed empirical research. Concluding remarks. The experience of reciprocal congruence and incongruence of the stock of knowledge between social groups is the expression in the social realm of the mechanisms of inclusion and exclusion that are firmly entrenched in the emergence of ordering processes. Alienness and ownness are not only inner-worldly relations of exclusion and inclusion, but they are also the result of drawing boundaries that distinguish an inside from outside and thus adopt the shapes of inclusion and exclusion. Following Struber, if we conceive the political as the redefinition of the reciprocities of the actor's perspective, then both exclusion and inclusion become clear as its constitutive moments. In other words, changes in proximity and distance between social groups are at the core of the dynamics in modern societies, causing different regimes of social inclusion and exclusion. For this reason, the experience of strangeness can be socially realized in different forms of discrimination, but it can also be instantiated through institutionalized patterns aiming at the consensual regulation of such tendencies. Thus, Schutzian approach to strangeness is also appropriate for studying the processes suited to decrease the reciprocal incongruence between groups. In that sense, Schutzian concept of social distance touched on the core of the problem of political order. Thanks for your attention.